Thank you. I'm Jeff Gutstadt. I'm a retired forensic pathologist, and I've been in the Pasadena Village for since about 2017. I'm now going to present a background of myself and my life. And every time I go to court to testify on a homicide, one of the first things they asked me is, what is your background and qualifications to testify in this manner? And so this is going to resemble what I say in court. I grew up in a suburb of San Francisco. I attended undergraduate college at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and I then attended medical school for 5 years at the University of Chicago. And my friend Ted is also at the University of Chicago. And following that, I did research for 2 years. I then entered a pathology residency at Mount Zion Hospital in San Francisco in 1979, followed by a year at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Long Beach from 83 to 84. I then practiced general pathology, general anatomic and clinical pathology at several places throughout California up until 1989. From 1989 onward, and I've there until I retired from the Los Angeles Medical Examiner Department of Coroner at the end of 2015. And I am board certified in anatomic and clinical pathology with subspecialty boards in forensic pathology. What I'd like to do now is tell you a little bit about the Los Angeles County Department of Coroner. Everybody, all the cases in the county come to the coroner's office, which is located at 1104 North Mission Road, where Mission Road meets Interstate 5. It is on the campus of LA County USC Hospital and Keck School of Medicine. And it is a single office. It is the busiest single office in the United States. And we handle, when I was there, we handled approximately 10,000 autopsies and external examinations a year. And however, they've gotten busier in the 6 years since I've left. And now last year they processed 13,700 cases, which is a lot of cases. And those were admitted to the coroner's office for either autopsy or external examination, or sign out as we called. Now, as far as the office goes, I want to describe a case, a typical case as it comes through from the very beginning up until we finish at the office. The case first is called into the coroner's office, and the coroner's forensic investigators are called to the scene, wherever the scene happens to be in Los Angeles County. Los Angeles County has close to 10 million people, so we're serving approximately 10 million people under our jurisdiction. And we send the coroner's investigators out to the scene. They compile a report of the circumstances surrounding the death and submit a report taking photographs of the decedent as well as any relevant photographs of the surroundings. The case is then transferred by the coroner's vehicle to the office. There, the receiving rooms are ready to receive the case. The case is then, meaning the body, is then fingerprinted, and the height and weight are obtained, and further pictures are taken if necessary. And following the processing, the case goes into the refrigerator prior to the time when it is further processed. There are 4 manners of death that we that we use. Either the cases come in as homicides, suicides, accidents, naturals, or undetermined or unknown. And the homicides are obviously well-profiled cases, and what happens is that each case is assigned a unique identification number, which goes with the case and prevents or certainly minimizes the probability of misidentification. The homicides, as well as any high-profile cases, obviously Michael Jackson and other celebrities would get the most favored treatment, of course. And the body is photographed both clothed and unclothed with the identification number in the picture. In the case of homicides, gunshot wounds, stab wounds, and so forth, all trauma is photographed by the forensic photographer. This includes gunshot wounds, as well as other forms of homicide, such as stab wounds, sharp force trauma, blunt force trauma, such as a bludgeoning, and any other trauma is well documented in the photography. Following this, in case of gunshot wounds or stab wounds, the body is x-rayed and fluoroscoped. All projectiles need to be recovered from the body, all bullets. So x-rays give us an idea of where the bullets and projectiles can be found. The bodies are x-rayed. Now, following this, there is a CAT scanner which was installed at the office somewhat time between the time I left and the present time. And bodies are submitted for CAT scan. I don't know the exact criteria, but they certainly help us to gain knowledge of the case and possibly sign it out rather than an autopsy. So following the photography of the body is fluoroscoped and x-rayed and prepared radiologically. The body is then removed to the autopsy suite. There, an external examination is performed in which all signs of trauma are examined and documented in diagrams and notes, and as well as any signs of natural disease that we find when we examine the body. Following this, the body is examined by internal examination, which is what we usually call an autopsy, in which the various organs and tissues are examined, again, for any signs of trauma or untoward event in the body, and also for any signs of natural disease that were unknown, and we include those in our report, of course. The autopsy generally takes from about an hour and a half to several hours, depending, of course, on the type of case. It may take several hours to perform. During this time, specimens are obtained, certainly from heart, blood, and femoral blood, but also in case of toxicology from other tissues such as bile, urine, vitreous humor from the eye, possibly cerebrospinal fluid, and bile and urine are some of the samples which are collected in certain cases. Blood is also obtained for DNA typing in the cases in which this is important. So during the autopsy, these are selected, and afterwards, the final paperwork is done, and the tox and other lab specimens go upstairs to the second floor of the main building, where they are processed. Now, toxicology generally takes at least a week to several weeks to perform. It's not like TV or Hollywood, where you can put it in a fancy machine and get the results of some sort of quantity within the first hour or half hour, whatever. The labs take a while to come up with their results. Excuse me. This is the process. And finally, the pathologist demonstrates and submits a report. The anatomic finding, the summary shows the trauma. And if a homicide shows the basically a summary of the trauma and possible injuries that exist, as well as natural disease. And the body of the report, of course, shows this in greater detail, and we submit the report as soon as everything is ready and we have a good idea of the cause and manner of death. What I'd like to do, in case some people might be interested in this, since so many of our homicides are gunshot wound cases, both in LA and elsewhere, obviously, to process these cases, we take each gunshot wound and examine it for several different characteristics. The entry wound is examined for shape, size, and whether there is soot or powder around the wound or small powder burns called stippling on the skin. The exit wound is again examined in a similar manner. The path of the wound is described, showing the path of the projectile, what tissues it has damaged, and the results of those the damage, whether loss of blood, exsanguination, or just plain trauma to the organs. The direction is determined for each gunshot wound, whether it goes front to back, or left to right, or right to left, or up, down, or down to up. That's also in the description. And finally, and there is the description of the projectile, the caliber of the projectile, the shape of the projectile, whether it's deformed or in relatively good shape. And then the final opinion involves the range of fire, and whether it is a through and through wound or not, and whether it is fatal or non-fatal. All this information is obtained for each of the gunshot wounds examined. And diagrams are used if we need the diagrams. And similarly for stab wound cases, it's a very similar protocol involving the description of the wound, the depth, including the depth and the size on the surface, and so forth. And stab wounds and other sharp force trauma are evaluated in this way. You also have incised wounds, such as cutting the throat or cuts other than this. There's also homicides with blunt force trauma, including contusions or bruises, abrasions or scrapes, or lacerations or tears in the tissue. So that is a description roughly of what we do with these homicide cases. The homicides vary, usually about 10 to 15% of the total cases are homicides, but they are obviously the ones given the most attention. Now, the processing of the case does not end there. I have testified in court on any number of homicides. This usually involves testimony in the state superior court. Occasionally, I do have the case is going to go to federal court when there are federal charges pending. The courts I most often testified in is the downtown criminal courts, which is downtown on 210 West Temple near City Hall, downtown. But I have testified all over the LA County, practically all the courthouses in the county, from Lancaster to Long Beach and points in between. And I've testified probably several hundred times in total. And testimony is very important, obviously. I testified and first tell my background, which is what you heard, and then I describe the trauma, describing each gunshot wound or stab wound or whatever it is, and answer any questions from the defense attorneys and the prosecution. And of course, then the jury and judge also participate, and later a judgment is rendered. So the testimony is very important as well. One of the things I wanted to mention, you might be interested in interesting cases that I have. There is one kind of quasi-celebrity case that I had in the early 2000s. This was the case of Bonnie Lee Blakely, which you may have heard of. She is the wife of actor Robert Blake from the 70s TV. And she was, the background is that her husband had gone into a restaurant club, and he came out to find her dead body in the car in the passenger seat of his vehicle. And she had suffered one gunshot wound to the head and one gunshot wound to the chest. It was a fairly straightforward case from the standpoint of processing the case. And of course, the more intrigue is that he was the suspect, and they went through the whole rigmarole of the trial. He had a preliminary hearing and as well as a jury trial, and I testified at both on both of those occasions. And he was, I believe he was either was hung jury or at the first trial, but in the civil case, they awarded a large judgment against him. So it was a mixed case. So a little bit about the laboratory. They have a DNA laboratory upstairs on the second floor of the main building, and they do submit samples from our office for processing. They do not process outside cases at this time, but the DNA obviously is very important, and they spent several years developing the laboratory and the techniques, of course. Another case that I was active in from prior is a case that I did at the San Francisco Medical Examiner's Office. I have worked at 3 medical examiners, as well as occasionally in other places in the state of California. I worked at the San Francisco Medical Examiners from 1989 through 1992. I worked at San Mateo County from 1992 through 1998, and then in the LA County Chief Medical Examiner, Department of Coroner, from December of 98 to December of 2015. One of the cases I had in San Francisco was a case of a prisoner in a single cell, only person in the cell, who was found with his head in the toilet. And after considerable consultation and so forth, and examination of the body with autopsy, we ascribed the cause of death to suicide by immersion in a toilet bowl. And he committed suicide by sticking his head in the bowl and, well, willing himself to drown. And this case I presented in a conference in 2003. And people might be quite skeptical about this case. There may be facts that are in error, or evidence that is in error, but it did go out as drowning, and the manner of death was listed as suicide. And the coroner's office, as you well know from the newspapers and so forth, has had his share of scandals and intrigue. It is useful that the chief medical examiner coroner has to be on reasonable terms with the movers and shakers in LA County in order to get money for budgets, et cetera, et cetera. So the usual political rules apply, and there are times when the coroner has made substantial errors, and and they've been in the papers, et cetera, and we try our best to follow all the rules and make sure everything is established certainly in the case of Ron Goldman and Nicole Brown Simpson Nicole Brown in the Simpson cases, and certainly in the case of Michael Jackson and other celebrities. So the usual political rules apply, and we've had our share of scandals and intrigue. And I believe I have covered everything that I covered in order to give you a general idea of my work and some of the things that it entails. And I'm available to answer any questions or comments that you may have. And I believe that you can ask the questions either by the chat or by the electronic hand or just the manual waving of the hand.
Okay. Yeah, everybody except Jeff is muted, and so when you want to talk, make sure you unmute yourself. And we do have a question, Jeff. Peter asks, what constitutes an autopsy?
An autopsy is both an external and an internal examination. The external particularly important in forensic cases, and so an external and internal evaluation constitute the autopsies. The organs are in an autopsy. The organs are removed one by one and studied. There is a specific order in which I remove the body organs and examine the tissues. And technically, the autopsy also includes any ancillary tests that come about. And technically, that's a part of the autopsy report that goes out with the autopsy. So technically, it is a part of the general autopsy with testing. Dick?
How do you drown yourself in a toilet bowl?
Well, that was a big question.
That seems like as soon as you lose consciousness, you'd fall out of it. Your body would take your head out.
Apparently, according to the background, his body was such that it didn't happen. Boyd Stevens, who was the medical examiner in San Francisco at the time, wanted me to present the case. I had my doubts myself, such as the one you stated. I presented the case anyway, but there was a little controversy connected with it, as I'm sure you've guessed by now.
Valerie had a question.
Yes.
Is the medical examiner's office under the jurisdiction of the sheriff's department, or is it a separate entity?
There are 5 different medical examiners, coroners for each of the 58 counties in California. They all operate separately and often at odds with each other, as you might expect. And the coroner has 3 major distinctions. There is the chief medical examiner coroner, which the major cities have. There's one in Los Angeles, one in San Diego, one in San Francisco, one in Alameda County, one in Sacramento County, and maybe others. There is the sheriff coroner, in which the coroner is under the sheriff's department and they operate together. And there is also a regular coroner, which is usually an elected position. And this is true in the majority of the counties which have either coroners, such as San Mateo County, or they have sheriff coroners. And I'm not sure which counties have sheriff coroners. I've worked mainly with coroners in San Mateo County and the medical examiners in San Francisco and Los Angeles counties.
Okay, Ted has a question. are there significant differences in processing suicides versus homicides?
The homicides are more extensively performed. In the case that's obviously a suicide, and there is no question about possible foul play or any worries about that, the case is photographed but is not x-rayed, and often there is no separate forensic photography done. If there is any question at all or suspicion of foul play, the case is treated as a homicide, even though it may have come in as suicide. And then you have what I've described, the forensic photography and forensic radiology and so forth. If any doubt exists, the cases are treated as homicide and high-profile cases.
Betty Ann has a question.
Yes.
This is so fascinating, Jeff. I was wondering if a family wants to have an autopsy done because they're not sure why their family member died. Is it free, and does your office handle that?
Occasionally it does. If the family has very serious objections and they state reasons why the case may not be as it seems, or there may be questions, we often take those cases and perform autopsies. So to a degree, sometimes if the doctor, the death certificate, and the private physician or some doctor usually has to see the patient, I think it's within a month before death. And if they can sign, sometimes we can release the body for separate autopsy at another institution, or else we may tell the family no. But if there are very serious questions about the cause of death, we would take the case and do an autopsy.
Okay,
Sally Curry. Oh,
Yeah, I have a question. I had the unique opportunity for me of assisting and watching an autopsy when I was taking a postgraduate course at UNM when I lived in Albuquerque. And there was an apparently accidental carbon monoxide poisoning that had killed the man, and his organs were all red. Can you comment on that?
the carbon monoxide frequently discolors the organs red. This is a very common finding and is a strong point in terms of calling the death of carbon monoxide poisoning. Cyanide can also cause reddish discoloration of body tissues. And often when you put the tissues in formalin with carbon monoxide intoxication, you get a pink tinge, red pink tinge to the formalin. So that's a further hint that that's what it is. And then finally, of course, you have the lab values of the blood showing an elevated carbon monoxide level.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bruce?
Yeah, I've got a question. You said since you left, they instituted CAT scans of the bodies. Does that seem to give a lot more information without being invasive? Like, I've had CAT scans looking for problems. And it also seems like they could store those CAT scans if there are any questions later. What have you heard on the use in it?
Well, that's very interesting. The CAT scanners are very useful, and in many cases of natural death, they help a great deal in determining the type of death, whether it involves the liver with changes in the density or the heart or other organs. A great deal can be learned from the CAT scanner. And in many cases, I don't know what their record is with the CAT scanner, but I would think that in many cases, they would not need to go to an invasive procedure like an autopsy. However, autopsies will never disappear. There are always cases in which I don't believe the CAT scanner would provide enough information. If there are multiple gunshot wounds and they have narrow tracks and you can barely see them with the naked eye on autopsy, I find it hard to believe that a CAT scanner would entirely substitute for an autopsy in those cases, and in other cases where the findings are very subtle. There are differing opinions on this. Some people think that many cases could be, wouldn't need autopsy and could submit a CAT scan with resulting sign out for cause and manner of death. I'm not sure of the extent of usage in the LA County Coroner's Office. The CAT scanner is located in a trailer away from the main buildings, and I was unable to view the CAT scanner when I visited about a week ago.
Okay.
Karen? Hello?
Yeah, I had to mute myself. What does fluoroscoping do? I mean, what does it tell you?
It's you have a kind of a cone-shaped device that you move around the body, and it takes, and you can, that way you can see what's going on in a particular part of the body. You can move the fluoroscope around until you have the whole body examined. It's very useful in finding bullets and other projectiles, shotgun pellets, as well as bullets and from pistols and rifles, etc. And it's a way to find specific things on, and that one can X-ray that you can then the main X-ray and use that. And that I'm sure has been digitized, and many changes have resulted since I left.
And who does the photography? There's an investigator that goes to the scene, but then who does the photography once the body is back in the office? Is that something that you did, or are there special people, photographers, that are trained to do just that?
There are special photographers who are trained to do the forensic photography.
Okay.
There's a special suite, a room with many different apparatus that are used in the photography, and special people are trained to do that.
Okay. Wayne had a question.
Yes.
Well, actually, I just want to make sure before I ask my question, Eunice had her hand up at one point, and I think, I don't know if she still has a question or not.
You guys are muted.
Do-
Catherine and Eunice, you guys are muted, so we can't hear you.
I'm looking for,
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
oh, okay. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I do have a question. My question has to do with, how did you get interested in this profession to begin with? What intrigued you? How come you chose it?
Well, first of all, I chose pathology as a general field. I liked working in the back. I liked working in laboratories, and this was a way I wasn't the best clinical doctor in the world. Due to patient interaction, I decided I wanted to work in the laboratory, and that would be more of a fit for me. And working behind the scenes and then giving information out to the rest of the hospital. And I found this more appealing than clinical medicine. And as far as forensic pathology, first I went into general pathology, general anatomic and surgical pathology, in which I examined tissues coming down from the OR, and we made our diagnoses based on those tissues. Later, I did a rotation I was working at the San Francisco Medical Examiner's Office at the time, and I had a month rotation at the San Francisco Medical Examiner's Office, and then I became especially interested in forensic path, and I was invited to come back by Boyd Stevens, the medical examiner, in following my stint at the VA in Long Beach to have a fellowship in forensic path, and then later on to work in the office from 1989 to 1992.
Great.
Okay,
Wayne,
now I have a question. This is kind of a leading question. When does your obligation to testify in court cases end? Did it end when you retired?
Well, it is leading, and I did neglect to mention that it theoretically never ends. Statute of limitations there is no statute for limitations of homicides. They can be adjudicated whenever. And there is a case that I'm working on right now. It is a cold case from 1993 when I was at the the San Mateo County Coroner's Office. This was a murder that took place in San Carlos on the San Francisco Peninsula, involving a man who shot a clerk at a store. And that case is due for preliminary hearing in March of this year, and possibly for jury trial as well. Cause of death was a gunshot wound to the chest and back. But court obligation theoretically never ends.
okay, we have a question from Peter. Have you studied the JFK assassination?
I've read, as like everybody else has read, about the numerous theories about the JFK examination. I don't think I have any more information to give you than what you've already seen or noted through the media. We didn't specifically during our training, and I doubt if I know much more about it than you do.
I've got a quick question. Can you get away with murder? Oh,
Well, they say that doctors and pathologists they would have special knowledge that the public may not have. That's possible. I've frankly have never thought about it. I've sometimes felt something like that, but I've never made plans like that. And I'm sure there are plenty of people who get away with murder that we never find out about. And I'm sure some of them are doctors.
Yeah. Just a wild thought there.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Okay, Karen Whitmore, you have to take yourself off mute, Karen. Karen, you're muted. There we go.
Okay. I wondered if all deaths are autopsied.
No, they are not. Many cases have an external examination only. These are called examinations or sign-outs, as the lingo is. And this is when we know of a cause of death, and it's a natural death. It's not sudden or unexpected, and we feel comfortable signing it out without an invasive autopsy procedure. And there are many cases that we treat this way. It is impossible with our volume to autopsy everybody. It's
Would imagine.
way impossible. And so this is what we do with many of our cases. Some of the cases that are called in never get assigned a case number because of the doctor signing the death certificate in a timely fashion, and there being no problem with cause of death or anything else. And those cases are released for signature by a physician. And many cases come under that category as well.
Thank you.
Okay.
Cara?
Yeah, it just occurred to me, when you're doing an autopsy, you must have to wear a lot of protective gear to protect yourself in case there's a disease that can be spread through body fluids.
We do. We wear 2 sets of gloves, a pair of gloves, especially that are wire mesh, to protect against certain types of injuries. Doesn't protect against all injuries. And we double mask, and we use special visors and filtration masks and caps and gowns and over scrubs. And we use a lot of different layers of protection against infection.
Okay, so you were very prepared for the pandemic to go to the grocery store.
Yes.
I saw.
I don't think they would ever let
all
me
that.
into a grocery store like that, but yes,
Okay, Susie and Phil Hoag have a question.
yes.
Hey Jeff, how you doing? All right, so we watch a lot of mystery shows, and I know more about British mysteries than I think coroners do. But do you ever watch a mystery show? Because there are so many of them that have coroners and cause of death and all of that. And what's your reaction when you're watching mystery shows? Are you upset by how they're portrayed, or do you often disagree with the procedures that they're using?
Most of the time it's fairly reasonable. I mean, there's some cases in which there's a death in the rural countryside of England, for example, and they have what are called police surgeons. And those can roughly parallel coroners in some cases. They're the ones that look at the body at the scene and then do an autopsy later. They're called police surgeons. Most of it is, there are always going to be a few things which we disagree with. But on the whole, they're reasonable in terms of their depiction of the situations and the cases for the most part.
Okay, we have a question from Dave Foles. How often is the conclusion unknown in the cause of death?
I'm not sure what the frequency of an undetermined manner of death is. We have several of them each year. I wouldn't be able to guess on a number. But whenever there is a lot of controversy about whether it's a homicide versus something else, and we just can't, with all the evidence and meetings and discussions, we're unable to tell, we will call it undetermined. Now, this is subject to change if new evidence comes up at a later time, of course, that indicates one or the other situation, then we can change. We always are free to change the cause and manner of death. So this is subject to change, and these are never cut in stone.
Okay.
The question is it a common thing, Jeff?
It's not very common, but it does happen. Usually we're able to come up with a manner of death and a cause of death, but especially in cases that are decomposed, for example, and there isn't much to look at. There's no evidence of atherosclerosis with hardening of the arteries, or there's no evidence of trauma of a specific type. They can go out as undetermined cause of death, undetermined manner of death, fairly frequently. When we usually can, even if the body is decomposed, we can make guesses to the cause and manner of death. But if it's so far along we can't, if there's skeletal remains only that we look at, that we don't find a defect in the head, for example, corresponding to an entry wound, then we will have to call it undetermined. And maybe that's probably the most frequent category when we do that, is of bodies which have undergone various states of decomposition and deterioration.
Okay, Betty Ann has a question.
Yes.
Jeff, if you're called in to testify about something 30 years ago, you must have awfully careful notes. How can you remember?
I was given the report,
Okay.
which is a business document. No, what I say is I have no independent recollection of that case, and I will say that in court. And unless I remember all the cases 39 years later or whatever, I won't have an independent recollection, and I will depend on the business document generated by myself to come up with my court testimony.
You mentioned that you might find a defect in the head. Are you able to find defects in the head of living people? Just a thought.
Well, sometimes it does happen that the forensic anthropologist, usually if it's just skeletal remains, and the anthropologist, the forensic anthropologist looks at a skull and sees a defect with a round hole and internal beveling, which means that the bullet or projectile is going inward. It has what's called internal beveling. Then she can say that this is that the at least part of the cause of death is a gunshot wound to the head. Now, as far as the manner of death, I don't know what we could say, but sometimes with skeletal remains, we can make these determinations.
I think Bruce was asking about living people. He was being
Living
funny,
people in
Jeff.
terms of what?
He was
Defect
being
in the head.
funny.
Well, we don't usually examine living people very much. Occasionally, we're forensic pathologists have been called to examine living people. I have not done so myself in my
Oh,
career.
wow.
I have not examined a living person in terms of making a forensic determination, which is the butt of numerous jokes, I'm sure. But occasionally people ask the pathologist to examine a case, maybe a case of possible sexual trauma or otherwise, and they're able to render some sort of opinion or add to the information given. And occasionally we are useful for this. Wayne, did you have a question?
Yes. Well, actually, I just was going to prompt you to explain how you handle cases that come in from the hospitals when there's accusations being made about the hospitals causing the death.
Well, those are very difficult cases, and we have to, as with any case, we have to examine all the evidence we have. We have to interview people on an extensive basis, and with any charge of malpractice or death, look at charts, examine them very extensively. This often takes weeks. Typically, these cases aren't signed out or completed for weeks while we do all this, and we come to an opinion. And we just have to study verbal contributions as well as charts and any information we can get our hands on in order to come to a conclusion about that. We have all sorts of consultants. We have neuropath consultants. We have a surgical consultant, Dr. Astorita, who specializes in cases like this. Many malpractice cases, we've consulted with him and he's rendered his opinion. And we get many consults just like doctors, just like regular doctors, if you want to call it that. And we just do our best to come to a determination.
What is your name? Something.
Okay, anybody else got any questions? Valerie.
I've always found it fascinating, and this is because I look at a lot of Law and Order, Midsummer Murders, on and on and on. But it's always interesting to me how much information they must have to research to come up with what kind of, like, let's say a knife, or if a sword was used, or, how the wound looks as to what the instrument that killed them was. Is that really what happens with you when you do like a homicide?
Yes, in stab wound cases, we can we use the shape of the wound, the width of the wound, often to decide what caliber of knife or other weapon was used. We often do that. We can rarely say, oh, this specific knife was used. We can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
A knife was used with the following characteristics we may be able to state. We can't obviously say, well, this particular one, the best we can do is that the police or whoever would bring us certain implements, certain weapons. Is it possible that he killed and we'd say, yes, it is consistent with, or no, it is not.
Mm-hmm.
But we can't say that this is the one. No.
Right. And this is one other thing they do. They always seem to be able to come up with, they have the shirt and they say, oh, the label says this, and I can tell it comes from here. And I said, do they really research that deeply that they, can?
We examine the clothing and make sure that the injuries on the clothing correspond to the injuries on the body. And we do that regularly with homicides. As far as tags or labels or whatever it is you're referring to, I doubt if we can do much with that.
Okay.
Kent?
Yeah, hi. Valerie's question makes me wonder, do you ever have cases where the murderer has attempted to disguise the actual cause of death? Like it appeared to be one way that the person died, but your research determines, oh no, it was really something quite different.
We occasionally get those cases, yeah. Not very often, but we do get them. And we have to make sure that to absolutely rule out what this suspect or whatever is trying to do before we come to the decision that this is more consistent with this cause and manner of death. But we do get those cases. They're relatively rare.
What was the most difficult case you ever had?
Well, it's probably a case of maybe there are 20 gunshot wounds, 15, 20 gunshot wounds, as well as some stab wounds.
Wow.
And taking a while to document all those using the protocols I've mentioned. There have been some complicated toxicology cases in which there are a number of different drugs, and we use our toxicology department and consultants to decide which drugs may have been important, which may have specifically caused the death, which were less important. And we frequently use the head of the labs and the toxicology personnel with those cases. This happens quite often. And those are probably the most difficult cases that I can think of. Sally?
Well, you know, when I watched the autopsy, I was overcome with a sense of awe and wonder. And I'm wondering, when you do this on a day-to-day basis, does that leave you eventually, or do you still feel that awe?
Well, it is amazing what the human body is. It's a tremendous machine, or whatever you want to call it. And it's amazing what you can find out with an autopsy. And in that respect, it's never outlived its usefulness, at least for me. I'm more conservative, and there was recently an article by a retired pathologist saying, we don't need an autopsy at all, just get rid of them. They're a pain in the ass, they're not recompensed by Medicare, et cetera, and I just disagree. There are some that need autopsies, and there are surveys showing that there are quite a few clinical causes of death or clinical evaluations that are in which the autopsy contradicts, and the real cause of death is different from what the clinical impressions were. This happens quite often, even with or without CAT scans. And there really are quite a significant number of cases in which the clinical impression differs from what we find.
Interesting. Thank
you.
I had a question about what about burned bodies? Especially murderers who try to cover up their murder by burning the body in the house and so forth. How do you handle those?
Well, you just have to, look at the charring, evaluate it, and check for signs that indicate definite trauma, in addition to the charring and burning of the body. And this can be very hard to do. It often is hard to collect tox in these cases. If it's toxicological death, we can usually, even if the body is superficially charred, we can get blood and other internal organs and fluids to do our tox with and come up with a possible secondary cause of death. But it's a careful evaluation for trauma as well as the tox, and without overcalling things that are artifacts, we just do the best we can in finding a possible cover-up or whatever that is.
Could that be end up being an undetermined case?
Possibly. if we can't definitely say that the test was due to acute something poisoning or intoxication or whatever, then it may very well go out as undetermined.
Okay, so now we're verging into the how to do a successful murder category.
Well, this,
If anybody didn't watch the, let's see, it's Netflix, How to Get Away with Murder. It was a bunch of seasons. It was very good. I watched it over the pandemic, and it kept me company while I was hunkered down during the beginning of the pandemic. So I could give you some ideas.
Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle and others have commented that doctors can be at the top of their line when it comes to murder, because they have will and they have determination and they have knowledge. And Sherlock Holmes said this in one of his adventures.
I want you all to remember that if I turn up dead one of these days.
Okay, any other questions? Jeff, this has been absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, this has been
Yes.
great.
Thank you, Jeff. Very fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. It's been so interesting.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, you're welcome.
You just find out
Glad to
what
do
to
it.
do
Well, probably about 4 years, we'll be doing this again.
Probably.
Thank you,
For
Jeff.
all our new members.
Thanks very much.
I'm gonna
Thank you,
stop
Rob.
the recording.
Okay.